Hello, and welcome to the Washington Farm Bureau Update, a podcast designed to provide the latest agriculture, legislative, and Farm Bureau information. Well, hello, everybody. This is Ben Tyndall here, and we are joined with our usual suspects. We have Tom Davis and Bree Elsey and Bailey Peters, and Caleb Guerder is joining us. Group, do you feel like you have just completed a marathon? We are now officially out of the 2020 legislative session.
Maybe a sprint marathon.
That's a good point. That's a good point. This was the quick session, and it felt very quick, actually, kind of looking back a little bit.
But it was a marathon that had like an earthquake at the end that distracted so much from what was going on at the legislature, and that earthquake being the COVID-19 virus, that it really was a great distraction, and for a serious reason. But it seemed to really downplay that the legislature was done with its work because it generated its own energy.
Yeah, it was a little anticlimactic.
It really
was not the number one thing on everybody's radar last week.
And to be honest, the legislature ended at the perfect time because I think had this been a long session that went through the end of April, I got to think the governor would have halted it just about now and then delayed it till after the virus has worked its way through and people felt safe to come back together again. Yeah. So it was good timing.
Now, maintaining social distance in the House and Senate chamber is tough. So, no, absolutely. This was definitely good timing.
And can I say, as far as that, Ben, that the proper social distance from legislators is what we're experiencing right now, and that is them out of Olympia and back home again.
That works. So this last week, basically, we were kind of waiting with bated breath for the budget, and that was the big drop toward the end of session, along with a couple other bills that I know you all are tracking. So give us your feel on the budget. How did that turn out?
So it was an interesting outcome. Coming into this session and the beginning of session, we kept getting revenue forecasts that showed that revenue had increased another $1 billion than what they had anticipated after they passed the last budget a year ago. So they had more money than they had planned on, and the thought was they were going to spend, everything. Well, what was interesting, the last couple of weeks now we're hearing the budget writers was very unusual in that they had planned to spend more, and the budgets that came initially out of the House and the Senate were at a higher spending level, but the one that ended up passing was at a lower spending level, and that was due to the fact that they were getting concerned about the impact to the economy of COVID-19 and wanted to put more money in the bank to deal with next year, or if they have to come back and do an emergency session because of the impacts of our state economy. So they had not experienced that before. As taxpayers, we should be thankful that they didn't spend as much as they could have spent. So that's a positive thing.
The transportation budget is the one I deal with, and it was quite large this year, actually. I think they exceeded $10 billion for the first time ever. Wow. So it's a $10.4 billion budget. The important thing about the transportation budget was, though, that it resumed all the paused projects that were ordered by the governor. And that was a priority, especially now that we're entering this economic downturn. Possibly, I don't know that we could have kept going the way we were going anyway. So it's really important to the economy to resume those projects. Also, there's some interesting studies that came out of it. I think this was kind of the year of studies. In a way, you saw that in a lot of different budgets, actually, and I think Tom will elaborate that in his budgets a little bit more. But in the transportation budget, there was a Washington Freight Advisory Committee, and we know now that all these trade deals that are happening, especially to impact agriculture, we really want there to be some freight studies done. Also high on importance for Washington Farm Bureau members is the road usage charge study. Will we ever be able to replace the gas tax? We know the gas tax is bonded out about 25 years. So will we ever hit a point where this is a palatable idea? And then lastly, just a rail safety study. We know as there's more passenger rail, more freight rail, we need to study that just to make sure that it is safe. So the transportation budget ended up being large and staying large, but I know that wasn't as reflective in the operating budget where they reduced it at the last minute.
So it sounds like there was a lot of work due to the legislature, but it's going to be trailing into the interim. A lot of these work groups, a lot of these task forces, there are a lot of work that you're going to be doing during the interim related to some of these things.
Well, that's hard in political science. I think if you had asked me this question last week, I would have a totally different answer than I have this week. Because as the economy is going to change, our priorities for next year are going to change. So these grand ideas that we had last year going into next session, will they come to fruition? It's just so hard to know at this point. And when you do political science, you really base your whole job on being able to predict outcomes, right? Using data to try to predict what's going to happen next. And it just shows you how rapidly our environment can change from every week, depending on the environment around us. So now I have no idea what they're going to do with these studies. Had I looked at the road usage charge study a week ago, I would have thought, okay, we're moving towards implementing a road usage charge. Now, as things are changing, I'm just not sure.
Now, you mentioned there was some pieces of the transportation budget that were governor priority. I know that there were some bills that we had previously talked about, specifically low carbon fuel standard and clean air. Can you update us a little bit on what happened to those? Because I know that those were also a priority of the governor's as well.
Yeah, and those were standalone bills. We talked a lot in previous podcasts about low carbon fuel standard, and I'll remind everybody that was the proposal that would have increased gas prices up to 57 cents a gallon and diesel prices up to 63 cents a gallon. And that bill did not pass, thanks in a large part to constituent outcry. I mean, there were a lot of Farm Bureau members that came in and testified and wrote letters and showed up to the committee hearings. And then we also had the Joint Timber Unity rally on the same day. And I think that had a massive impact on the outcome of that bill. So that was a governor priority legislation. And again, if I was going to predict last year, I would assume that that was going to be another priority piece of legislation next year. Now with the economy, I'm not sure if that's palatable anymore. So we'll just have to see what ends up happening with that. But I do want to remind our listeners that we are still in the middle of the PSCO rulemaking. That's the Puget Sound Clear Air Agency. That affected the 4-county region of Snohomish, Kitsap, King, and Pierce counties. And they were in the middle of their own rulemaking that would have established a low carbon fuel standard. And so that rulemaking is still moving forward. They've had a comment period, and we are awaiting results as they go and review all those comments and try to make a decision. A lot of that was waiting on whether or not the state was going to implement a statewide policy. Now we know the state is not implementing a statewide policy. What will become of that regional rulemaking? And then another bill that had a lot to do with that same issue was what we called the CAR bill, or the Clean Air Rule bill. It was House Bill 2957. That would have given Department of Ecology authority to enter into rulemaking on carbon policy. In a way, this bill was even more dangerous than the low carbon fuel standard bill, because you're giving an unelected bureaucracy the authority to implement carbon bills. And what we know about the legislature, in a way, it's kind of safe because they always have to have a finger on the pulse of the people. And they're a little vulnerable because if they do something wrong, they can be not reelected, right? So when you pass over authority to an unelected bureaucracy, an agency to implement those same policies, I think in a way that's much scarier than giving the legislature authority to do that. So both of those were priority pieces of legislation for the governor. Both did not pass.
Well, with that list, Tom, are there any other bills that you would want to touch on that you were tracking and want to give us an update?
So maybe I'll use a bill to segue into the budget. 6518 was the bill that in its original form would have banned the use of the pesticide chlorpyrifos. And then it came out very bad, a very bad bill out of the Senate. It was a little less bad because they added some crops that would not be subject to the ban, but it still would have impacted tree fruit. Came to the House, was amended in the House Ag Committee, was amended in the House Appropes. So in the end, 6518 simply directs Department of Agriculture to go into emergency rural development and develop a rule that would include specific control measures, and I'm reading from the bill, for chlorpyrifos that are designed to reduce emissions sufficiently so the public is not subject to levels of exposure that may cause or contribute to significant adverse health effects. That pretty much is the guts of the bill now. From what it was to what we now have we saw that as a win. Now, we would have preferred this bill died in its entirety, but the way that it passed was okay. And $299,000 was given to Department of Ag to do the rural development. And then there was also language in the bill that said additional funding must be provided to the Department of Agriculture for training and enforcement of the Washington Pesticide Application Act. That did not happen. And we don't know if that was a mistake, if that was one of the funding issues that was pulled out of the budget at the very end as they were looking for dollars to cut. But what we do know is this has been going on for years. They complain about improper use of pesticide applications, and yet they won't give us more money to do more training. It's hard to know exactly what's at the heart of this, but we have continued as an ag industry to ask for more money and still don't have it. Now, they did give $280,000 to WSU that will go to the Commission on Pesticide Registration. For one of the agreements in the bill was to give them more dollars for research to look for alternative chemicals that can be used in place of chlorpyrifos. Right now, they don't exist. For them to come in and get the label approval, it has to go through the research. And so this will start that process for research. So as far as the budget, again, the budget came out right there at the end. Very little opportunity for conversation. They went to caucus, the House and Democrats in Senate and the House. They reviewed the budget. They came out and they voted on it and they went home. That's the way the final budget negotiations work. So we're left, when they're done, to look and see what they did rather than, hey, can we try to influence a change? At that point, no change is available. So here's a quick overview that we have seen so far. Water banking was a huge issue starting last summer when the Seattle Times article came out about a particular group of investors had moved into Washington and were buying up water rights as an investment. That rankled some folks. And we thought there was going to be legislation this year introduced that would pass. That didn't happen as far as the passing of it. But there is a work group that's created. A representative from the farming industry will be part of that conversation. We don't know yet who that will be, but it's in Department of Ecology's part of the budget. The Conservation Commission received about $332,000 to do more technical assistance with landowners. It's not going to be a huge boost to the CDs, but it'll be of some help. Fish and Wildlife got $300,000 for what you'd call elk fencing. If you lived in Skagit County and you lived between Cedar-Woolley and Concrete, you know why people are talking about elk fencing, because of their elk problem. And it specifically mentions providing funding to build a fence around the Concrete School District's playfields, because it's right there by the airport and the elk tend to congregate in that area and create an unsafe situation for both the kids and for the planes that are trying to land there. There's also $462,000 for pinniped population control. And if you don't know what a pinniped is, it's seals and sea lions. And this is in the lower Columbia River, where the population of these seals and sea lions has grown dramatically. And as the numbers of out-migrating fish and the returning fish are being severely impacted by these pinnipeds, as long as they can get a federal permit to do so, Department of Fish and Wildlife can use this money to help reduce the population. Now, we'd also talked about net ecological gain over the last, several weeks. There's money in the budget here for Fish and Wildlife to do a review of the impacts, if indeed this net ecological gain standard got put into our land use, development, and environmental laws and rules, and then a report is due back. Given what could have happened, that's not a bad outcome. They didn't pass it into law. That all of this new standard we put in place, it's requiring a rule before they come back and do a further discussion next year. Again, our druthers would be that this thing just go away. It's a bad policy. It'll be damaging to developers, to landowners, to farmers. So we will continue to keep a close eye on that. With the Department of Agriculture, they also got some funding. I think this is coming from the same senator who also chairs Ways and Means, who also ran the chlorpyrifos bill. She also ran one on aerial application of herbicides in forestry situations. So there's money in the budget for a review of pesticide investigation rules and processes, and including how complaints should be reported and ensuring that complaints are properly referred, is language from the budget. It can be a true claim, it can be a false claim, and this doesn't differentiate between the two. That all have to be channeled up to some central location that would review them. It's a continued review concern, I think, an attack on the use of pesticides. So we'll continue to watch that, although in this case, this is more focused on the timber industry. Now, on wolf issues, there was $320,000 provided for additional range riders in that northeast part of the state in Ferry and Stevens County, specifically Ferry, County, on federal grazing allotments. The bulk of the wolf packs are in that area of the Northeast, and the center right now of problems is in that northern part of Ferry County. And for those grazing allotments to remain viable for the livestock producers, something has to be done to reduce the impacts on their livestock. Unfortunately, the governor continues to send a message out that he doesn't want the department to kill. He wants them to kill fewer wolves and use more non-lethal methods to protect the cattle. But in that territory, it's heavily timbered. There's lots of hills. It doesn't work. The non-lethal methods aren't as effective there as they might be in more open country. I appreciate the governor's position. I think he's wrong. And this money will be helpful, but not 100%. It won't solve the problem because it simply just doesn't work in that kind of country. So it'll create more pressure going into this grazing season. if the department's got pressure from the governor that they can't kill problem wolves. It could cause the whole situation to blow up, and that's a real concern.
Now, Tom, it seems like wolf population and the wolf problem, as you sometimes calls it.
Yes.
It seems like that is obviously a huge concern for our members and, farmers and ranchers. And it seems like it's a part of legislature each year. And is there a solution, would you say? I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, but I would foresee that this will come up again next year, and it was prevalent the last few years. So what can we expect as this continues to be a problem?
Well, first, let me do a shout out to Representative Kretz, who the reason why it's brought up in the budget every year is because he's able to get funding in there to provide some level of assistance to his constituents. The problem is the wolves did not disperse when they got into Washington and started to hold ground, in a sense, as far as developing packs. Initially, a dozen years ago, we thought that they would outmigrate and fill in voids, outside of the Northeast. Well, they really haven't done that. And they haven't gained a foothold in Okanagan yet for whatever reason. And they really haven't dispersed south all that much either. So the fact that they continue to stay in one area and just grow in their population, really to the point where the density of wolves in that area exceeds what you find in Idaho. Because in Idaho, they have dispersed. So it creates more of a problem than what should actually exist in the wild. And that's why it requires humans to come in and manage that population so that you protect not only the livestock producers, but our deer and elk populations as well that are getting decimated because there's too many wolves in one location. So it'll require other management strategies that are being used in Montana, Wyoming, where they actually, in some of those states, have hunts for wolves. And that's, all of that is part of reducing the overall wolf populations. Once they've recovered, then you have to manage their populations so that they don't decimate the other species. And we don't even talk about cougars anymore. And the cougar populations in the state are about as high as I remember seeing. And that's kind of the untold story.
That was one article I believe I sent to you, Tom, was one of the management practices that they've resorted to in Idaho was that the Department of Fish and Game, or their department in that state, had started providing money to a nonprofit, and they were actually giving out wolf bounties. There was up to a $500 or $1,000 reward for going out and killing wolves in problematic elk recovery areas.
Yeah, so we might call those a GMU, a game management unit. Yeah, I think it's where it was an area where elk populations had been at one time pretty healthy, and now we're being wiped out by the wolves. Yeah, so I think at some point we're going to have to get to that, but we have a couple of overactive national environmental groups that their whole method of business is to sue. And they keep coming into Washington and tying up the hands of Fish and Wildlife by filing lawsuits, which makes Fish and Wildlife get pretty gun shy. They start to implement some kind of management strategy, and then they get a threat of a lawsuit, so they pull back. It's not a good way to manage.
Well, now that we're at the end, what were some of the wins? I'd love to pull Caleb in this. What have you seen, this being the first session that you've really worked in the policy field? What were some of the wins that you saw? What were some of the things that ideally going into future sessions we could even build on?
Just from my general observations, I would say I was pleasantly pleased, if I could say that. I was impressed with the bipartisanship that actually did happen, the compromises that were coming from both sides of the tables on certain legislative pieces, and the ability that our lobbyists had working with other organizations and changing bills that benefited agriculture and our farming families. That was one thing that I was impressed with this session.
Tom, how about you? Was this a session that you felt we moved the ball forward? Maybe some things happened that if in future sessions you feel like we could build on and grow?
So we're in a different state of the state of Washington, I guess, as far as politics. So to say that we move the ball forward with agriculture now, with the makeup of the majorities in the legislature, if we can protect what we have at the end of session, to me, that's a win. This is not the season to try to get new policies pushed forward. So we got the chlorpyrifos down to a point where it's acceptable to us. The farm worker contract bill was reduced to just about nothing. So sadly, those are the wins for us.
Absolutely.
Now, when I look at taxes, nothing changed in the tax preferences for agriculture this year. To me, that's a win. Mm-hmm. As far as additional regulations that impact our industry, nothing significant got passed. So for us, again, that's a win. So when we, as is Oregon, as is California, ag is impacted by big cities that don't understand our industry. So if we can get through a session fairly unscathed, then we feel pretty good.
Absolutely. And I remember even from previous podcasts, we've talked about some of the relationships that were developed this session, even with some members that maybe we didn't even realize, at least on certain issues, would be allies that might be able to go to and perhaps work with. So hearing some of the advocacy and the work that was accomplished, the relationships that were developed, those sound like wins that can certainly be built on.
Absolutely. And there were some couple other wins. Tom, did the animal cruelty bill pass at all?
So that did, and that was the one that Bree was working on.
Yes, and that's when she was working with cattlemen's to be able to get ag exempted from that bill.
Right, and so that ended up, again, in a condition where they basically took us out of it. One of the wins I would say with that also is the way that we were able to pull in some of our members, like Jill Swanick from Eastern Washington, who's a vet and also a farmer. Getting people like that to provide expert input into the language that was being worked on to us is so invaluable, and it helps all of our members.
I think that's definitely what I would have to say too. I'm a sucker for a good pull at the heartstrings story, and we really rely on our members to bring that story pretty much year round. We're a grassroots organization, and when we see our grassroots really activate. And I think we were able to get ahead of the narrative a little bit with the kickoff rally that King Pierce had. It's a small but mighty act, and we can keep building on that momentum. And so I would just encourage members to, just because session ends, like we talked about with Bree earlier this week, there's still a lot of things that we can do, and we're still going to, even more so next year. I mean, the environment's not going to change in the legislature, so we're going to need members more than ever as we continue to year by year go into this. So,
and this is an election year, so all of the House members that are running for re-election, all of them are up for re-election. And there's some that are retiring or running for different offices, but the bulk of them are running again. This will be a great year for our members to reach out and talk and set up meetings or phone calls with their local legislators, because this is the time of year that the legislators are especially interested in talking to their constituents, because it's voting time. And, over the next 6 months, reach out and talk to these folks. If you don't know them, build a relationship with them, talk to them why farming is important and why extra regulations, higher fuel costs, how that impacts your farm operation. But a way to paint the picture to legislators that next year when they come in, again, with low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade, carbon tax, we need to do a stronger job of portraying what the reality is, because we're going to see all of those bills again next year. So that's the kind of thing we need to continue to send that message to these legislators, to educate them on the impact of their actions.
Well, team, I think that does it for us. As always, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. As we're moving into the interim, we want to encourage you to step up and reach out to us. We're going to be continuing this podcast during the interim, but if there are some suggestions or questions or ideas for future podcasts that you may have, please feel free to reach out to us via email or Facebook, call our office, however it is most convenient for you. Do not hesitate to reach out and let us know. We would love to hear from you. With that, have a great week, and we look forward to chatting again soon. The WFB Update is a production of the Washington Farm Bureau, the voice of agriculture in Washington State, ensuring our family farms continue to feed the world. To learn more, visit our website at www.wsfb.com.